last lesson one, and then we continue with today. So last week we read chapter 1, and chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 is sort of one section, and we introduced some of the players, some of the main characters, and what we did not, and we also discussed the main tension in the story in chapter 1. And as we explained, it seems to be that there's a young woman. There's also her beloved. We're not sure who her beloved is right now, but later on it seems that the beloved is the king. So this woman comes from a small little desert town in the Judean desert, Ein Gedi. See if I can mute everybody. Ein Gedi, and she has this love for this king, and the king and her, till their wedding, sort of the first two sections, there's tremendous conflict. In other words, conflict means tension. There's difficulty in them sort of playing out their love and being able to actually unite. The good news is that they get married. The even better news is that after the marriage, the tension continues. So we have, it will keep us busy here for a while. So we discussed that chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, which we didn't read yet, refers to the fact that the woman is looking for her beloved, and he is not really exactly telling her exactly where he is. She's almost like going too fast for him. She asks him, "Where are you?" He doesn't really tell her. He tells her, "Oh, go look for me between the shepherds." He doesn't really tell her where he is, and she keeps saying that, "Oh, why don't we?" She talks about her house and her furniture, implying that she wants the relationship to be established and be firm and be consistent. He is not there yet, and that is the first problem. She is more rushed than he is. Problem number 1. Problem number 2, as we mentioned, is that they have come from different cultures, meaning they come from different places, they have different values, and it's expressed in the Song of Songs, in that they don't express love in the same way. And that's just a metaphor for the fact that they don't see life the same way. And we pointed out 2 major ideas, and that is, number 1, for her, all the metaphors for love are taken from the field. The tree, the apple tree, the flowers, because that's what she knows. For him, the metaphors are taken from more of a palace life, and that is, he talks about the chariots of Pharaoh. He talks about jewelry, which the simple girl does not have, and that's one way where you see that there's sort of the miscommunication. The other miscommunication you see is that she wants to be with her beloved alone. She doesn't like all the hubbub of the capital city and of the palace. And of course, for the king, that's impossible. The king has other people around, other guards, other girls, other women. It's an exciting time. So that's also what he thinks is love, and what she thinks as love looks very differently, and that's part of the challenge. We know that the song begins, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs to Shlomo, to Solomon. Either Solomon is just a name, but Solomon could be referring to God. The Talmud says that whenever it says Solomon in the Holy of Holies, it's the name of God. But if you read the story simply, we're talking about King Solomon, because King Solomon is the author of the book. Now, King Solomon, of course, had 1,000 wives. So you understand that any one of them the desire would be to be alone. And that's part of the conflict here. So we point out two places where she is more anxious than he. Her understanding of what love looks is different than the way he understands it. That's the metaphor. What is the interpretation? So most people believe the interpretation is referring to the time of Egypt and the Exodus of Egypt. So the Exodus of Egypt, on one hand, they have this relationship because God takes the Jews out of Egypt and he says, "Follow me into the desert." That's like where the man tells her, "Follow me, look for me amongst the shepherds." But the other problem is that the love is premature. And where do you see the love is premature? In the fact that there was the sin of the golden calf. And we said last week that the sin of the golden calf comes from a misunderstanding of what a relationship with God is. For the woman, for the Jewish people, they're looking for a concrete, tangible expression of the relationship. But that's not from God's perspective. So in other words, the big sin when you read the book of Exodus, the big sin of the sin of the golden calf, sort of the worst sin possible, when you look at it from the lens of the Song of Songs, which is the love story, here it's not so bad. It almost like forgives for it, because it says, yeah, the relationship is premature. They don't see the world the same way. The woman does not have the maturity to understand what the relationship is supposed to look like, and in that sense, she is really forgiven. So if you look at it from the lens through the lens of love, then even the greatest sin is not really that big of a sin. So that's fascinating. So that was chapter 1, and that's what we discussed last week. Now we move to chapter 2, which that story is still continuing. In other words, it's still the discussion between the woman and her beloved. And what's happening is she is more anxious than him. He's not telling her where she is, but he is willing to go along with her and still express his love. So she starts praising herself. He's willing to praise her as well. She wants to be brought back to the home. She wants him to embrace her. He's not there yet. So if you open chapter 2, you see that this theme continues. Again, the theory is going to be that the section ends verse 7. So sort of the verse 7 of chapter 2, verse 8 of chapter 2 begins sort of the new song. So what we're going to read now is sort of a continuation of the pattern that we read last week, which is why I felt it's important to reiterate what we read last week. So he's not telling her where she is, but he's still expressing love. She says, I am a rose of Sharon, a rose of the valleys. He responds, verse 2, he goes along with the metaphor. She wants another, you want to be a rose? Fine, I'll buy you a rose. Want to be a rose? So he agrees. He says, as a rose among the thorns, so is my beloved among the daughters. That's already interesting, because not only is he saying that she is a rose, but she's saying the other daughters, meaning the other women, are like thorns in comparison to her. So again, we see that what she wants to feel exclusive. He's going along with that a little bit, and he's indeed not only praising her, which is what she did in verse 1, she praises herself. In verse 2, he even goes further than that and contrasts her to the other daughters and says that she is like a rose amongst the thorns. As an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the sons. In his shade I delighted and sat, and his fruit was sweet to my palate. Again, that's she talking. But now she keeps going back to the metaphor of a home. He brought me to the banquet hall, and his attraction to me was symbolic of his love. So you don't really see it in the Hebrew, in the English, but in Hebrew, Heviani el Beit Hayayin. Here they translated banquet hall, but Beit Hayayin literally means the home of wine. Beit, home, right? She keeps going back to the metaphor of a home. And then she says, sustain me with flagons of wine, spread my bed with apples, for I am love sick. His left hand was under my head, and his right hand would embrace me. Now, again, in the Hebrew, it's not past tense. It could be future tense. It could be that this is what she is aspiring to or hoping for. So what does she want? She wants his right hand to embrace him. She wants to be embraced. She wants the bed to be spread with apples, right? She is much more committed than he is. Where is he? He's not even telling her where he is. And here we have an interesting verse that appears 3 times. Or 4 times, I think 3 times throughout the book. And we'll elaborate it sort of when we get to the end of the book. But here she says, verse 7 is fascinating. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you neither awaken nor arouse the love while it is desirous. It's not clear what this verse is saying. She's making all the other daughters promise not to awaken the love, either while it is desirous or until it is desirous. So one interpretation that we're going to go with is what the understanding is that because she feels that the love is developing on its own, she now comes to the realization that you can't rush it. And that's what he says, don't awaken the love until the proper time shows up. So now she realizes the problem. The problem is that she is more anxious than him. So she tells, she's telling the daughters of Jerusalem, but in a sense she's telling herself, is take it easy, let the thing develop naturally, let the relationship develop naturally, don't awaken it prematurely. Okay, that's the end of section 1. And again, the commentators, when you talk about the metaphor is talking about, most people believe is talking about leaving Egypt and the Jewish people, in some sense, wanting to have so there's 2 aspects. In some sense, they sin. In other words, they sin with the golden calf, and then when they repent, they get the tabernacle, the Oil Moed. God says He's going to dwell amongst them in the second half of the book of Exodus. But on the other hand, they want permanence, and permanence is still very far away. There won't be any permanence until the marriage. And I'll give you I'll spill the beans. The marriage is the building of the temple in Jerusalem more than 400 years later. So the Jewish people have an urge for permanence. From God's perspective, permanence is too premature. So yes, He gives them the tent of meeting, but He doesn't have, it's not a permanent dwelling, it's not a permanent structure. So that is the first section. Now we could start today's class. If anybody has any comments, just to clarify from last week, it's good. Otherwise, we continue. Okay, what's the big picture of the second song? We're up to the second song. The second song continues from chapter 2, verse 8, and goes all the way to chapter 3, verse 5. So what's happening here is as follows. Here we have another story, which is a problem. We have to figure out what to do with this story. But the other story, the story we're going to read now is as follows. Now the tables switch. If in the section 1, in this first song, the woman was more anxious than the man, now for whatever reason, maybe because of the sin of the golden calf, maybe because of the bad smell we discussed in chapter 1, now for whatever reason the table is turned. While the woman understands that you can't rush the relationship, that's what she said, don't awaken the love before it's desirous, don't rush. Now the man is actually more anxious, and he comes to the woman, and the woman basically tells him, I can't go now. I can't be with you now. Why not? She's in the fields. There are foxes coming. I have to guard the field. Why don't you come back later? That's what happens in the second song, and we have to figure out what's happening here, and of course, what is the metaphor? But that's the struggle here. So what happened in chapter 1 happens again with chapter 2, in other words, song 1. What happens in song 1 happens again in song 2, but it's from the opposite perspective. Here, the man is searching for the woman. The woman says, now is not a good time. What happens after that? Still in the same song. When the woman says it's not a good time, and then she realizes that later in the day, the sun sets, she realizes that the man never came back. She said come back later, but he never came back. So now she's nervous, he's never going to come back. Maybe she discouraged him completely. She didn't mean to, she meant to delay. And now she's lying in bed and she can't find her beloved. So what does she do? So she goes around the city, she walks around town looking for him. She can't find him. And she asks, and then the guards of the city ask her, who are you looking for? She says, I'm looking for my beloved. And the end is, she says, I found him. And I'm not going to let go until I bring him to my mother's, basically to my mother's home, which we'll discuss that verse when we get there, but it's certainly not marriage yet. So, and then the end of the second song, we have the repetition of the verse where she says, she makes the daughters of Jerusalem swear not to awaken the love prematurely. Again, it's a repetition. You see the same thing that happened in the first song. It's happening in the second song. from the other perspective. So I think what we should do is we'll read quickly a few of the verses, and then we'll try to figure out what is the interpretation. But before, again, like we said last week, before we do the interpretation, we want to do the metaphor. So the metaphor, I think section 2 that commentaries are explaining, section 2 really begins in verse 8. And if you didn't read chapter 2, verse 8, if you didn't read the beginning, you think the story is a completely different story. The story is that the beloved comes to her, the man comes to her, and is trying to tell her how beautiful nature is. Let's go out, let's run, let's go places. And he brings all these beautiful metaphors from the field, how nature is coming back to life. And she is not ready to go. So let's read verse 8. The sound of my beloved, behold, he is coming, skipping over the mountains, jumping over the hills. So here you have the opposite. The enthusiastic lover, the man, is jumping over hills to come to the woman. My beloved raised his voice and said to me, arise, my beloved, my fair one, and come away. In other words, the beloved, the man, is telling the woman, why don't you come with me? And this is his pitch. For behold, the winter has passed, the rain is over and gone. The blossoms have appeared in the land. The time of singing has arrived. And the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. Right? In the ancient world in Israel, you don't travel in the winter. And if you travel in the winter, you're going to get your pants dirty or your dress dirty because there's almost mud. What does she say? What does he say? He says the winter has passed, the rain is over, things are growing, it's beautiful, nature is beautiful. He continues with the metaphors, 13. The fig tree has put forth its green figs, and the vines with their tiny grapes have given forth their fragrance. Arise, my beloved, my fair one, and come away. So he is trying to get her to come. I don't know what's happening, what happens. I don't know exactly where she is, but in 14, she's not coming. So now he says, if you don't want to come with me, at least let me see you. So if you look at verse 14, my dove, which is a metaphor for love, my dove, in the clefts of the rock, in the curvature of the steps, show me your appearance. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is pleasant and your appearance is comely. So what's happening here is not only is she not coming with him, but he can't even see her. She's not even appearing. So she says, please appear. I want to see you, and I want to kolech orev. At least I want to hear your voice and see your appearance. But she's not coming. Why isn't she not coming? Here's the excuse. 15. Seize for us the foxes, the little foxes who destroy the vineyards, for our vineyards are with tiny grapes. She is basically saying, I have to guard the vineyards. We have foxes. You just told us how nature is blossoming, so somebody has to protect nature, the field, from the vineyard, from the foxen. So that's why she can't come. My beloved is mine and I am his, who grazes amongst the roses. Just like in section 1, when he didn't come with her, he praised her, he gave her something. She praises him. She says, oh yeah, we're together, but in reality, she's not showing him, she's not going with him, and she's not even showing him her face or her voice. And then until the sun spreads and the shadows flee, go around, liken yourself, my beloved, to a gazelle or to a fawn of the hinds on distant mountains. Basically, she says, we started the song saying that he's jumping over the hills to her. She says, why don't you jump and go the other way? Come back later. That's what she says, come back later. Now, if you have the Chabad.org, you turn to chapter 3, you hit the chapter 3, and here comes the problem. The problem is, she says, come back later in the day. What happens is, later of the day happens, and he never comes back. So now she's getting nervous. So what happens later in the day? So now, if you look at chapter 3, verse 1, you read, on my bed at night, I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but I did not find him. I will arise now and go about the city, in the marketplaces and in the city squares. I will seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but I did not find him. Again, the problem is when he was ready, she wasn't ready. And now at night, when she's ready, he's nowhere to be found. So she has to go out of bed and she has to go looking for him around the city. The watchmen who patrol the city found me. Have you seen him whom my soul loves? I had just passed them by, meaning she passed the watchman. I found him whom my soul loves. It could be she actually found him, but if you read the Hebrew, it's poetic. It could mean I'm going to search for him until I find him. So we'll leave that alone for a second. I held him and would not let him go until I brought him into my mother's house and into the chamber of her who had conceived me. So now she actually brings him or she wants to bring him. Bring him where? Not to her own home, not to their own home, but to her parents' home. Now you have the verse appearing again, verse 5 that we said in the first song. We had in a little different form. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the hinds of the field, that you neither awaken nor arouse the love while it is desirous or until it's desirous. That's the end of the story. That's the end of section 2. So now we have to figure out what is the metaphor and what is the meaning. But at least we know the story. The story is that he comes to her and she is busy. She's caught up. She has to take care of the fields. She's worried about the foxen. And she says, come back later. And later he doesn't really come back. So she has to search for him. And finally, either she actually does grasp him or she wants to grasp him and she brings him to her mother's home. Okay, what do we do with this? So again, we're referring to, according to most opinions, we're referring to the Song of Songs, in addition to the personal relationship with God that every individual has, which we can discuss that later. Now we're talking about the historic events between God and the Jewish people. And if the first song was, we discussed events that took place at the Exodus of Egypt and in the aftermath of the Exodus of Egypt, most people believe that the second song is also talking about generally the same period. And so why do you have a second song if it's talking about the same period? And in fact, it seems not only that it's a second song, it seems like it's a contradicting song, because song 1 seems to be saying that the woman is available and the man is not. And song 2 seems to be saying that the man is available and the woman is not. So why do we have two songs telling two different stories? So the common interpretation is that they're both songs are referring to generally the same time, but it's discussing the same event from two different perspectives, from the perspective of the man or the perspective of the woman, perspective of God and perspective of the Jewish people. So what really happens is God appears at the Exodus, but he doesn't necessarily appear the way the Jewish people want him to appear. So from the Jewish people's perspective, the man, God, is hiding. He's not really here. I have to search for him. From God's perspective, I'm here, I'm trying to get you. And the woman is not fully present. And the test is the fact that some people didn't want to leave Egypt, and some people served the idol, et cetera, et cetera. So both stories can be true. And typically when you have a relationship and you ask the man, how was the date? And you ask the woman, how was the date? You're not going to get the same story, right? Especially if one person comes from Ein Gedi and the other person comes to the city of Jerusalem from the king's palace. So it's not surprising that the same story, the same general period is going to be retold from the perspective of the man, from the perspective of God, after it was told from the perspective of the Jewish people. And this is a very famous metaphor. If you want to apply this to the Jewish to the Exodus, I'm going back to chapter 2, verse 8. The sound of my beloved, behold, he is coming, skipping over the mountains, jumping over the hills, right? If you look at many Haggadahs, some Haggadahs, I don't know if you ever saw it, Haggadahs sometimes on the cover have a picture of a deer jumping over hills. Why? It comes from this verse. Why? Because the metaphor of God coming to the Jewish people is coming with the speed of a deer. Why the speed of the deer? So one interpretation is that God actually came very fast to get the people out of Egypt. Why? Because originally God said that the slavery would be for 400 years. And in reality, it was only for 210 years, right? So there are different interpretations how to deal with that discrepancy. But one interpretation is, yes, of course, God actually brought the redemption early. And that's what this verse refers to. The verse refers that when the beloved comes, when God comes, when the man comes, he is jumping over the mountains and over the hills because he's coming with speed, like the gazelle. And then that's what verse 9 continues. My beloved resembles a gazelle or a fawn of the hinds. Behold, he is standing behind our wall, looking from the windows, peering from the lattices. So this is actually very interesting. So it seems that she's in the home. She's not letting him in. He's peeking through the cracks. He's looking inside. How do you apply that to the metaphor of God and the Jewish people? All of a sudden, when the Jewish people realize that God is taking them out of Egypt, now they realize that God was peeking in all along. In other words, that God was aware of their pain. And that's part of the process of redemption, when you realize that God was present. We were not abandoned. And then we continue the metaphor. The winter has passed. The rain is over and gone. So what does that refer to? So the rain is the years of the slavery. The blossoms have appeared in the land, says the Medrash. Who are the blossoms? The blossoms that are growing? Moshe and Aaron. The time of singing has arrived. The zamir could either be singing or it could be the singing bird. It depends how you read it. It means the same word. So who's the singing bird or the time of singing? Time of redemption. I'm reading verse 12, chapter 2, verse 12. And the voice of the turtle doves is heard in our land. Who's the voice? Says the Medrash. That's referring to Moshe. Moshe is the one who announced to the Jewish people that they're going to have the Exodus. And then it continues that the metaphor of the nature coming to life, and it's time, and God says, come with me, go escape, go come with me. And the problem is that eventually we get to verse 14, and verse 14 seems to be saying, we're trapped. My dove is in the clefts of the rock, and the Jewish people are not available to God the way God wants them to be available for him at the Exodus. So that's the challenge, that God is here, God is present, but the Jewish people, even though they leave Egypt, but they're not available. In some sense, they're trapped there's some sense they're trapped and with the idol worship. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that it's actually referring to the splitting of the sea at Egypt, splitting of the sea after the Exodus. So what happens after the Exodus? The Jewish people are trapped. Why are they trapped? Because they have a sea in front of them, Pharaoh behind them. They're trapped. So the Medrash says that's the idea. The dove is in the clefts of the rock, and it has a bird of prey trying to get to it, but inside the rock, there's a snake. So it's sort of in between. It can't go anywhere, and it's trapped. And says the Medrash that why does God orchestrate the splitting of the sea, that the Jewish people should feel trapped at the sea? Why? Let's read the verse. She says in the story, he tells her, I can't see you, you're trapped. At least seeing your Hashmi'eni, show me, let me hear your voice. Let me see your appearance. So the Medrash says, Rashi quotes it that when he says, hear me your voice, is that the Jewish people are crying out to God at the sea. So God wants to hear them. So he says, let me hear your voice. And another interpretation is that it's not referring to crying to God before the sea split when they are in despair, but it could be referring to the song that they sang to God after the splitting of the sea. But again, it's God is calling to the Jewish people. He says, even if you're not here fully, how do I know you're not here fully? Because later they're going to sin. But he says, I want to hear you. I want to hear you sing, and that's what happens at the splitting of the sea.
Rabbi, are we still on chapter 3?
No, we went. I apologize. We went back to chapter 2.
Oh, okay, because I got lost.
I'm sorry. I apologize. So we're back to chapter 2, and in other words, we went from chapter 2 to chapter 3, And then when it came to the interpretation, we went back to chapter 2. We're still chapter 2, verse 14.
Okay.
I apologize for that.
Okay.
Okay, and then we have here the way in verse 15 we talk about the seas for us, the foxes. In this interpretation, the foxes are the Egyptians who destroy the vineyards, and they of course were struck were drowned at the sea. And then we get to 17. What happens in 17? 17, the woman says, "I'm not ready. Come back later." And Rashi explains, the commentaries explain, this is referring to Sinai. This is referring to the golden calf, right? The golden calf. He says, come back another time. The Jewish people are not ready for God right now. They're too busy serving the golden calf. So when he is ready, they are not. Rashi says it could be referring to the golden calf. It could also be referring to the sending of the spies. What's the sending of the spies? God wants to take the Jewish people out of Egypt and rush them into Israel. And in reality, what does the woman say? The woman says, "I'm not ready yet. I'm busy. Come back later," meaning I'm not ready to go into Israel now. Come back in 38 years. Come back in 40 years. And that's indeed what happens. And then we say, so that's what it is. She says, "I'm not ready for you." We're going to turn to chapter 3. We turn to chapter 3, refer to the night. She's lying in bed at night. What is that referring to? Say the commentaries say, Rashi, the night is the 38 years after the Jewish people sinned with the spies. And in those 38 years, we know that it's like nighttime. We know that God did not speak to Moshe, did not reveal his presence to Moshe in the same way for those 38 years. So it's nighttime. And when it's nighttime, the Jewish people are now yearning for God, because now they realize that when they were not available for God, they hoped God would wait around, but God did not wait around. In other words, it's nighttime, God is not here. So then the verse 2 in chapter 3 says, at night she's going around, looking around. I'm searching for my beloved. So what is that referring to? That's referring to the Jewish people through Moshe searching for God, praying to God. After both sins of the spies and the golden calf, Moshe and Aaron, on behalf of the people, pray to God. And then he says, so that's looking around, in other words, seeking God. And then we get to verse 3, where it says, the watchmen who patrolled the city found me. They said, have you seen whom my soul loves? In other words, we're asking the watchmen, where is God? Who are the watchmen? Again, Moses and Aaron. And then it says, Kimat shavarti mehem, I had just passed them when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him, I would not let him go until I brought him into my mother's house and into the chamber of her who had conceived me. What's happening here? As soon as I passed them, as soon as Moshe and Aaron passed away, right? We got away from the guards. We got away from Moshe and Aaron. And then who's next? Joshua. That's when we find God. Where do we find God? When we enter the land of Israel. So then he says, I grasped him and I did not let go until I brought him to my mother's house and into the chamber of her who had conceived me. What's my mother's house? It's not my house. It's not our house. Our house would mean what? Our house would mean the temple. But here, it's not our house, it's my mother's house. Your mother's house, it's still not, the marriage is still not, has still not come into effect, and therefore you don't have your own house. So the commentaries explain, Rashi quotes it, that my mother's house refers to the tabernacle in Shiloh. When the Jewish people entered Israel, they had the tabernacle in different cities for those almost 400 years. There was a temple in Shiloh for 369 years. That, according to Rashi, is the interpretation of she found him, she brought him to her mother's house. And why do we need this metaphor? Because on one hand, there's a certain permanence. They are together. We were together with God at the temple of Shiloh. On the other hand, it's not the permanent state of the marriage. The marriage did not happen yet. Marriage means permanence. And it was not permanent. The relationship was not permanent until Jerusalem was chosen and the temple in Jerusalem was built. So therefore, it's sort of an in-between stage. We are with the beloved, but not in our home or in the home of the beloved, but in the home of our mother's home. That represents that the relationship is not yet permanent. So now with this, we conclude the basic interpretation of a second song. Other people that don't like that explain the overlap, right? If you remember, we said that the second song is generally talking about the same period of time of the first song of the Exodus. Other people don't love that interpretation. So instead, the way they read it, if you want it to be more linear, meaning going through, meaning that it's just developing, it's not overlapping. If you want to say that it's developing, then you could read it a little bit differently. And there are other Midrashim who read it differently. And the other way to read it is that the second song is referring not to the Exodus of Egypt, but it's referring to the period of the Jewish people in the desert, as well as the period of once they cross into Israel, the entire period of the Judges, all the way up to the era of King Solomon. So when she says that the beloved comes to her and says, time to go, that is not referring to Egypt according to the second interpretation. It's referring to let's leave the desert and go into Israel. So the rain, and he says the rain has passed, the winter has passed. That refers to the 38 years in the desert. That has passed. And what happens now? Kol HaTorah Nishma B'Aretzeinu. Now it's time to sing in our land. That's Israel. Yet in Israel, we know the story. The story is that the entire 400 years, after that as well, but at least in this first period, there's a cycle where people on one hand are loyal to God and then it lasts for a little bit, and then they turn away from God and serve the idols, and then God sends an oppressor, and then God sends a judge to save the Jews from the oppressor, and the cycle continues. And that's, according to some interpretations, that's what the second song is referring to. The fact that on one hand, when he comes to her, she says, I'm not ready, I'm too busy serving idols. Then it's nighttime, God is gone, they don't see the presence of God, and they're being oppressed. And then they search for God, and then they find God again. So again, either the second song is an overlap of the first song, it's referring to the same events, the Exodus from Egypt and the traveling through the desert. It's just saying it from the perspective of the man as opposed to the perspective of the woman. Or then the story continues, the narrative continues, and it's continuing now. While the first song is referring to the Exodus of Egypt and the time in the desert, the second song is referring to the time in the desert and the period in Israel up to the building of the building of the temple in Jerusalem. And finally we get to song 3. I don't think we'll have time for it today, but song 3 is the finally after they get their timing right. In the beginning, she's seeking him and he's not available. In the second song, he is seeking her and she's not available. Right? That's the story. That's the story of dating. When he's available, she's not. When she's busy, he's not. And when she's available, he's not. So it's just frustration. That's the first 2 songs. Finally, we get to, in the section number 3, begins with the marriage. And again, whose marriage? It's complicated, but it begins with the marriage. And then you would expect the song to end and they live happily ever after. But of course, marriage is not the end. Marriage is just the beginning. And therefore, the song doesn't end with the marriage. And we get to the 4th song and then the conclusion. So we still have work to do. But so far, we're referring to the idea that this is a book about the story of Jewish history up to that point. But again, everything here, we're not going to go into it today at length, but everything here can be reinterpreted as one's personal connection with God. And that's how some people read it, that it's Solomon really singing to God and he's tracking his own personal connection to God. And if it's true about Solomon, it's true about all of us. And what you get from these 2 chapters is that sometimes there's an inspiration. You seek to connect to God. You want to inspire yourself, but you don't feel God reciprocating, right? I want to be a good person. I want to do the right thing. I want to inspire myself, but I don't feel the universe. I'm showing I feel God or the universe or God through the universe reciprocating and showing me that things are going my way, etc. And on the other hand, that's one challenge to the relationship with God, that I see God, but I don't feel like God is reaching out to me. The other challenge is the opposite. God inspires me. I have a moment of inspiration, but I'm distracted. I say, look, I can't deal with it. I have other things on my mind right now. Why don't the inspiration come back tomorrow? And of course, the challenge is that the inspiration doesn't come back tomorrow because it doesn't always come exactly when you want it to come. So the story of the second chapter, if you want to apply it to your personal life, not just to the historic event, it's that when the inspiration comes, seize it and take the moment and don't delay. It's true about God. It's true about relationships. It's very true about my son is home. Yeah, he's not here. Hopefully he's not listening. Typically with your children, this is the way it works. Whenever you want to talk to them, they're not available. Whenever they want to talk to you, it's like usually 10 minutes after bedtime, when they have now 2 hours to tell you everything they want to tell you in the past 100 years, and you're not available, right? So again, it's a question of timing. When the child is available, the parent may not be available. When the parent is available, the child is not available. So maybe this lesson of the second song, or even the first two songs, is when inspiration comes, you seize it. When the moment comes, you seize it. If you have an opportunity to connect, don't say, okay, we'll connect tomorrow. We have another few years until the kid goes off to college or to yeshiva. No. Seize the moment is the message of the song, of the first two songs in the Song of Songs. So again, you can look at this as a historic event, or you can look at it as history playing itself out in the soul of Solomon, in Solomon's relationship with God. And by the way, if we had time, we could track how Solomon's relationship with God also has the ups and downs. But we'll leave that for now. And then you can also interpret this song to us, to our own personal life. There are moments that I see God, and then I'm frustrated that maybe the God is not reciprocating exactly the way I thought he would. And then there are moments where I feel inspired, but I'm already too tied down to my old habits to be able to tune into the inspiration and make meaningful change in my life because I'm busy. Literally,
Rabbi,
figuratively. Yes.
Rabbi, who is considered the author of Song of Songs?
The tradition is that it's Solomon. If you want to read the book, Solomon could be talking. Typically, we understand. When you read the first verse, Shir HaShirim Asher L'Shlomo, the Song of Songs to Solomon, sounds like Solomon is writing the book, which he is. But typically, at least the beginning, is Solomon writing the book from the perspective not of Solomon, but the perspective of the woman who actually is in love with Solomon. In other words, the one who loves the king. We said that Asher L'Shlomo to Solomon doesn't mean that Solomon is the author. It means that the author writes a song to Solomon. Right? So at least the beginning is a perspective. There's a narrator that's going to come in more later, but now it's a lot of this is the woman. Most of the song is the woman speaking. So this is the Jewish people talking. It could be the Jewish people collectively, or it could be every individual Jew, or it could be Solomon himself, because Solomon himself also sings this song to God. And when he sings the song to God, he is the woman in that scenario.
Rabbi, was there controversy over including songs in the canon?
Absolutely. The Talmud says there's a machlokes, there's a disagreement whether or not it's one of the books of the Torah. Rabbi Akiva says not only is it holy, but it's the holy of holies, and therefore it was included. What does it mean that it's holier than all the books? In some sense, it could be many things, but from the perspective just what we discussed today, it's holier than all the books because all the books. Take for example the story of the Exodus of Egypt, the way it appears in Book 2. The way it appears in the Book 2 of the Torah, in the Exodus. The way it appears in the Book of Exodus, at least the Exodus itself and the aftermath, the sin of the golden calf, we come out very bad, right? We sinned 40 days after we received the Torah. We sinned, there's betrayal, God doesn't want to know us anymore. Moshe has to say, don't kill us. And we keep sinning time and again. And that's the way the Torah looks. That's like the legal book. But what happens when you put on the glasses of love, you put on the glasses of romance, you put on the glasses of the Song of Songs? Here, in other words, the story is much more accepting. We don't describe the sin, as betrayal. We simply describe the sin as the timing is not right. He wants her, she wants him, everything is fine, but their timing is not right. Or their communication is not right because their understanding of the universe is different. So you see that now we're re-examining the history, but we're re-examining it through the lens of love. And when you re-examine it through the lens of love, the entire story has a different ring to it.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. So we'll stop here. Next week, we'll do, God willing and good health, we'll do Song 3, which is the wedding and its aftermath. And we have a lot to do because section 3 is very long. But if anybody has any comments or questions, there's a lot of details. Naturally, at the speed and the rate we're going through the book, there are a lot of details that we're going through quickly. And there are many more details that we don't address. Maybe next summer we'll go through the book more in detail, but I'm trying to give sort of a general overview as much as possible. But if anybody has any questions or any comments, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll continue this, God willing, next Wednesday at 10 a.m.
Thank you, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.